Well, again, I want to say happy Tree Week to everyone and welcome. Before we get started, we will be recording this webinar so that we can put it up on our YouTube page and share that with you. So if you've got, someone who might enjoy seeing this at a later time, all of the webinars in our series for Tree Week this year are available, and you can catch up on past Tree Week series on our YouTube pages. And I also wanted to mention that we have another Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Team Tree Week event happening tomorrow, live and in person at Gardenside Park in Lexington, Kentucky. And that's happening at 10 a.m. in beautiful trees and better stream buffers. So if that's of interest to you, make sure to check it out. As well as the many other great Tree Week events. If you've been joining for Tree Week and have something that you really enjoyed for Tree Week, please let us know and put it in the chat, share that with others. And we're going to go ahead and get started talking about tree diseases in Kentucky's woods. So my name is Ellen Crocker, and I am an extension professor of forest health here at the University of Kentucky. So I'm a state specialist that covers the issues of invasive plants and tree diseases and insects and things that negatively impact our trees and woods across the state. And today I'm going to be talking with you about some of the common diseases that pop up in our forest trees, how to identify them, damage implications, and potential management strategies. Naturally, with 45 minutes together, we're going to cover everything that could possibly come up. No, just kidding. We're going to cover a portion of what you might see. And in particular, I'm going to focus on some of the big types of diseases. So I'm going to talk about canker diseases and wilts and foliar or leaf diseases and rots, as well as general declines. And these are big classes of tree disease that you might see. Kentucky has over 100 native tree species, and it would take us all year if we wanted to go through all of the different things that can impact them together. So I'm going to focus on these major classes, a few notable examples of each of them, so that we can cover a breadth of different types of issues and management options. I know we've got a wide range of folks joining today, from professionals, people who've dealt with this for a long time. So hopefully this will provide a more general introduction to the topic. And if you've got particular questions, feel free to put those in the chat. Regardless, we are so excited to have you joining today for the webinar, but also for Tree Week in general, and hope you've been having a really good one. So without further ado, so many diseases, so little time. Let's get started. So first, I want to talk about two types of diseases, cankers and wilts. And on the surface, they might look really different because, a canker might refer to something like this that's happening on the twig or the bark or the trunk, and wilt is looking at like droopy leaves, wilted symptoms in the canopy of a tree. But for both of them, the problem for the host tree is what's happening in the vascular system of the tree, that really important part of the tree that's under the bark, that's where the water moves around in the tree, the nutrients move around in the tree. So in the canker, that's going to be a response in the branch or trunk or twig. And for the wilt, what you're seeing is the symptoms in the canopy and the foliage, but there's probably something that's happening underneath, maybe under that bark, that's resulting in those symptoms. Many different things, from living pathogens like fungi and bacteria to abiotic problems, can cause these kinds of symptoms. But the ultimate issue here is something that's impacting that vascular system of the tree, and then the host's ability to defend itself and respond to that. So let's start there with some different cankers and wilts that you might see. So a canker is an infectious disease of the phloem, which is the part of the tree that moves around water and nutrients, as well as the cambium, the part that's responsible for new growth on stems, branches, and twigs. these pictures here show different types of cankers, and there are a lot of different ones. In general, as that tissue is killed, the underlying wood is going to die. And this might be in small patches or maybe in bigger clusters. You can see here a large patch, a small patch, an area that's kind of gotten gnarly over time. And this tends to progress little by little over time for most of these. So you're going to have that tissue death progressing over time. There are many different causes from those pathogens out there, living organisms, to maybe something abiotic, some wounding, some exposure that created this response in the tree. Sometimes these are going to look really different. You might have sunken cankers where the shoot continues to grow around it and you get this deformed growth. Sometimes it might be cracked. Sometimes it might be built up in kind of a target-like shape, like what we saw in the earlier picture. You might get bleeding cankers with this ephemeral bleeding that comes and goes on the side of the tree. What's actually happening would be invisible until you peel back the bark and see the dead patches underneath. So let's start it out by talking about one of the most famous canker diseases in our area and a historic issue, and that is chestnut blight. So chestnut blight is an example of a pathogen that causes both wilt and canker symptoms. And while most of the photos you find of chestnut blight online are going to be historic photos of these massive trees, American chestnut, before the arrival of this invasive pathogen. American chestnut used to be a really common species in a lot of the eastern US. In the southern Appalachian region, it might have been 1 out of every 4 trees. Very important species for wildlife, eating the nuts, for humans, making things from it. And then an invasive fungus, chestnut blight, effectively has wiped it out. But you will still see plenty of chestnuts around in the woods, but they look really different. They're never going to be a big, tall tree because of this disease, because of chestnut blight. They're going to get killed once they get to be a certain size. So you might see more of a shrubby growth pattern. And that's what we've got in these pictures. This is a shrubby chestnut right here, an American chestnut. And you can see at a distance, it's growing, but you've got some disease symptoms right here. You got this dead branch with the leaves still held on it. It's a sign of wilt. People might call it flagging. Either way, you've got dead branches. And then if we look up close at what's happening there, on an individual stem, you might see kind of loss of bark, cracked bark, a sunken canker, the tissue on the plant. You might also see the sporulation. This orange stuff right here, that's the fungus making spores. So the first symptoms that you might see of something like chestnut blight might be in the canopy of the tree, but the problem that's causing it is in the stems there. So whenever that shoot gets big enough, it's going to be killed by that fungus. And that's the reason why we don't have chestnuts currently, is because after the invasion of this fungus, it will infect chestnuts. Now, the problem is it also infects other trees, and it doesn't cause the same symptoms on them, is not lethal. So it's going to stick around in our environment and be a problem for chestnuts whenever they show up in the future. For American chestnut. Now, there are other species of chestnut. Chinese chestnut in particular is grown for the nuts and is more resistant to this, so it's not going to be as big of a problem. Here you can see another symptom or a picture that really kind of demonstrates that canker symptom that we're talking about right now. You can see this cracking right here. The bark looks a little sunken. You've got these orange spores right here. This branch is dead, or it will be soon. Since the root system isn't impacted, another shoot will probably come up, only to be killed again. Over time, this will likely kill the tree unless the tree has a lot of light, a lot of access to resources. It's probably going to die off before it can reproduce. Now, there is a lot of exciting work that's being done trying to bring back chestnut and restore chestnut, but I think it's a really good example of how invasive pathogens, non-native pathogens that cause major problems in our area, can have a long legacy. And if you're interested in that, I encourage you to check out the Kentucky chapter of the Chestnut Foundation. They're doing exciting work, as well as other researchers, to try to restore this through breeding trees that are more resistant and other other approaches to that. But it's a good example of, cankers and what they look like. But it's not the only canker that you might see, or even the only thing that might look like this. Well, this is something you're going to see on American chestnut. We don't have that much American chestnut around in our woods, much less in our landscapes and urban areas. But there are a lot of diseases that can look kind of similar to this. So here's one that is maybe a distant relative of that chestnut blight fungus, that is called Nectaria canker, and it might look pretty similar in some ways. You can see kind of similar sunken cankers, this similar orange sporulation, and in this case, it's around these branch wounds. Do you see where there used to be branches here and they were pruned out, and you've got these kind of stubby leftover parts that haven't quite sealed off right? Trees are totally different from animals or humans when it comes to how they defend themselves from diseases. Trees are never going to heal in the way that if you had a cut and it would heal over time. That's not really something that trees are going to be able to do. Instead, what they're going to do is try to seal off that damage and prevent whatever's causing it from infecting new tissue. But they can't really heal in the same way. So in this case, it's trying to seal off this wound, but wait, there's a fungus in there that's causing problems and preventing that. So this is Nectaria canker, or commonly called Nectaria canker, caused by a fungus. It has a really wide host range, but you'll see it most commonly on beech trees as well as maples and more. And this is a beech tree right here. And pruning wounds are a common entry point, or any other kind of wounding. This fungus is an opportunistic pathogen, so it's going to take advantages of opportunities if they arise and infect those wounds. That fungus will then grow and kill the bark, impacting that vascular system of the tree. And it's really hard to manage once it's established. It's one of the reasons why it's really important to be careful when you're pruning trees. You want to make good pruning cuts that really give the tree every possible advantage if it wants to be sealing off those wounds and preventing other things from getting in there, instead of leaving big jagged stumps like this kind of thing. It's really not thought of as a wood decayer. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those rots later, but those infection sites can also be colonized by a range of wood rotting pathogens. So if you look in here, you'll see, oh, like not only is there this orange stuff, there's lots of other stuff going on there, probably different fungi that are taking advantage of that resource. So cankers often develop and expand when the host is dormant, and the extent of the damage to the tree is going to depend on how much growth and compartmentalization the tree host can put on during the growing season. Is it enough to offset the growth of the fungus and the damage that's caused by it? When you've got a really even balance of that, you might find something like these perennial target cankers. So in this case, you've got a layer of wound response that is produced and killed each year. So when the host is active, it makes a little roll of this tissue trying to seal off the fungus. When the host is dormant, the fungus is going to grow a little bit more and try to kill that tissue. So you'll get these rings that gives it this target appearance. Now, how bad is this? It really depends. It depends on, the host and the pathogen. Is the host growing great? If so, it can probably grow faster than, in this case, this fungus. If the host is really weak and the tree is not doing so hot, this could be a bigger deal. And as we talk about tree diseases, we're going to find that it really varies. Some, like the chestnut blight I mentioned, are invasive issues that can kill healthy trees. They are a serious issue for any tree that, it can be infected. So in this case, chestnut blight, American chestnut. But many, many, many other diseases that we have and you'll commonly see tend to be minor stressors Not a big deal. If the tree is growing well, it can deal with that. In the same way that, if we get sick, we can deal with a lot of little things. Where that can be a problem is some of these things can stress trees so that they become susceptible to other issues, as well as the fact that once trees are really stressed, you can see more problems, kind of a nail in the coffin to what's going on. Here's another very common canker that you might see, especially you'll see it all over in the woods, in yard trees. Where I most commonly see it is in trees that are in a severe state of decline. They are dying, or they're dead or getting close to it. You'll also see it on logs and in the woods. This is something that can live on dead tissue as well as living trees, and that's called hypoxylin canker. This disease is caused by a fungal pathogen, Biscogniaxia acropunctatum. Try to say that 3 times fast, and other related species. And you can see in this photo a stressed red oak that has been in decline for some time. If you were to zoom in on this, you'd see that there's construction happening. They've ripped up all the sidewalk and road around it. The roots are probably really compromised, and that tree is stressed for a variety of reasons. And how that's expressing is if you look up in the canopy, you can see signs that big branches have died over time. And if we look up at one of them, we can see this kind of sunken canker right here. And even some of this black sporulation, that's the hypoxylin canker. So this fungus actually infects trees when they're young and healthy, and just hangs out and waits for the tree to become stressed, waits in the bark and in the sapwood. And when the tree is healthy, it doesn't do much. But once the tree becomes stressed, it will become more active and grow more and form these cankers on trees. So something that is definitely triggered by the tree's own decline. Very common in a lot of our stressed trees, especially those stressed red oaks. Now, everything that we've been talking about up until now are some different types of cankers, but you can also see what are called bleeding cankers, oozing wet spots on the bark. And here's kind of what it might look like on the outside. But if you were to trim back the bark, what you would see are these dead patches under the bark, these dead patches of tissue. Many different organisms can cause these types of bleeding cankers. Things like Phytophthora. Phytophthora cankers are a common issue in our area. Different fungi, like Fusarium species, can cause these. And the damage really varies from very minor ephemeral issues, not something you really need to worry about, to something that's going to grow over time and become more serious, especially if these dead patches, or lesions as they're called, coalesce and cut off the vascular system of the tree. That can be lethal. So treatment for this type of canker, well, many of the other cankers that we talked about might include pruning that out if you wanted to, promoting the overall health of the tree, or in the case of that invasive chestnut blight, breeding programs that are really actively looking to introduce resistance. Treatment for these types of bleeding cankers really depends on the causal agent, what's causing that. If it's caused by an oomycete, for example, a Phytophthora species, treatment would be something that targets that group. That would not necessarily be the case if it was caused by a fungus. You might use a fungicide. Now, all of that's really tricky because you can't tell by looking at it what it is. In fact, that's typically going to be more of a lab diagnostic test. And, here in the state of Kentucky, we have got county extension offices that can look at these for you, can accept samples to send to our plant diagnostic lab at the University of Kentucky that can do some of those analyses. So that's a really wonderful resource. But just a note that for many of these diseases, it's really hard to tell what's causing them, and your treatment options are going to vary depending on that. So let's shift from talking about cankers and talk about wilts, which again, in many ways is kind of connected to cankers, in that what we're really talking about is issues with the vascular system of the tree. Now, in the case of wilt, what we're looking at is the wilty canopy. When we say wilt, we're looking at a symptom of something that's going on in the canopy, maybe droopy leaves and shoots, maybe a lack of leaves. The tender shoots and the leaves lose their turgor and become droopy. This might be followed by the death of the plant, the affected parts, and it can be caused by many different things. So anything that results in a lack of water is going to result in those symptoms. You could have a severe drought. You could have root problems. You could have a canker that is below that branch. If the tree doesn't have enough water, then you're going to see those kinds of symptoms. But when we're talking about wilts as a group of diseases, we're typically talking about a specific group of different diseases that are caused by pathogens in the xylem, the part of the tree's tissue, that wood that's going to be moving water from the ground up through the tree. So of course, anything that's going to impact that region is going to result in those water stress symptoms. That could be a lot of different things, and many times it's made worse by hot and dry weather. So if you do have a pathogen that's in there clogging up the xylem, maybe when the tree has enough water to spare, it's not a big deal. But if you do get hot and dry weather, you can see the trigger of those symptoms. And that's a huge issue for the tree. So as an example of that, I want to use another invasive disease that we have in the state, and that's laurel wilt disease. It, as the name implies, is a wilt in that it causes those same wilty symptoms. Here you can see early fall color, and that is also associated with a sign of stress in the tree and a loss of water, as well as dead trees. Laurel wilt disease is a lethal, invasive issue that is killing sassafras trees in Kentucky. It is pretty recent. It was first detected in the state in 2019, and since that time has been killing many sassafras tree species. And how is that happening? What is it looking like? So you can see some of the symptoms here, the dead trees, the trees with the wilty symptoms and early fall color. But those are being caused by this invasive fungus that is in the vascular system of the tree. And you can see this streaky black staining here. That's not normal. That should not look like that. That's the fungus that is clogging up the vascular system of the tree, as well as the tree trying to defend itself. It's trying to keep that fungus from spreading and shut down the movement of water through its tissue. And all of that together is resulting in a real water stress within that tree and those wilt symptoms that you see. So you might see this staining in the bark, and that's a sign of those kind of issues that are causing the wilt. And an interesting thing to note about laurel wilt disease is that it's not only an invasive fungus, but it's an invasive insect that's moving this fungus from tree to tree. So another thing you might see with laurel wilt disease, and it goes hand in hand with the symptoms, is tiny little holes, tiny little beetle holes, tiny little toothpicks from where these little beetles have been burrowing in the tree, tunneling around. And here's the beetle. It's red bay ambrosia beetle that is moving laurel wilt disease from tree to tree. Both the beetle and the fungus that cause this disease are native to Asia. There, they kind of cause minor amounts of damage on trees, not really a big deal. Here, the beetles are attracted to trees that are healthy, whereas most ambrosia beetles are going to be more attracted to trees that are stressed and already in decline. And then the fungus, ambrosia beetles are fungus farmers, and they take fungi with them and they seed them into their tunnels to feed the fungi. It's actually really cool, and there are lots of different species of ambrosia beetles, both native and non-native, that you can find here. This particular one, this invasive red bay ambrosia beetle, not only is it kind of odd in that it likes the big healthy trees first, but the fungus is also doing something really weird here. There's a mismatch. Instead of saying localized to those tunnels where the beetle feeds, it becomes systemic and creates this huge effect in the tree, triggers this response that is lethal. So it's a really unusual situation, and you'll see that sometimes with invasive pathogens, and that the trees just don't have the right defenses to them. They haven't dealt with them before, and there's a total different response than what you'd see in some of our native issues. So laurel wilt disease, just because it's such a new thing, I wanted to mention it a little bit more. Here's where it is in North America. Again, native through in Asia. Our particular laurel wilt disease is believed that it could have been just one beetle, likely coming from Taiwan on maybe some contaminated packaging material, introduced here. And the whole thing can be caused by one little beetle, so it doesn't take a big population. Spreading out through this part of the country, mostly feeding on red bay laurel. So the name is laurel wilt. And that points to the fact that this fungus is really only an issue on plants in the laurel family. So for our area, that's going to be sassafras and spicebush. But if you go further south, they have a few other trees that can be impacted. Red bay laurel, but also avocado. So the avocado industry has been hit really hard by this issue. But you can see that, it was initially over here in coastal areas on red bay, but more recently it moved up to us in Kentucky. And those little beetles, while they can fly, did not fly that far. Probably came in on contaminated firewood. We won't really know, but firewood is an excellent way to accidentally move things around. Those beetles are so tiny. You could easily miss them and accidentally move them to a new area. It's one of the reasons why we really recommend not moving firewood very far, because you can have some hitchhikers that you really don't want to be spreading. So here in the state of Kentucky, here's a map of where laurel wilt disease is right now. In many of the areas that I visited with it, the death of sassafras trees has been pretty complete. Like almost all of the sassafras trees in those areas have been killed. And it's kind of slowly moving its way through our state. I will say that it seems to be worse in the areas with a high density of large sassafras. So we'll see what that means for other areas. As we discussed with chestnut, we are looking for trees that might be resistant to it. Maybe they're out there and they have some natural defenses, as well as testing fungicides for protecting individual trees. And there are some fungicide options for protecting an individual tree that has laurel wilt. Unfortunately, it's not really an option for a tree that's already infected. This would be something to do preventatively. And it doesn't last, it just lasts a year or two. So something that would need to be repeated over time. And there are a number of fungicides that are currently available for that. But there are other wilts that can do similar things, and I wanted to mention a few of those. One of those is oak wilt. So we mentioned laurel wilt, which kills sassafras trees. Oak wilt is a disease that is lethal to oak trees, especially to stressed red oaks. And we love oak trees in the state of Kentucky. We have lots of them, and would not like to see something that rapidly kills them. So oak wilt, again, you're going to see the symptoms in the leaves, this leaf scorch from the outside edges in. But what's actually causing the problems is under the bark. You've got fungal pathogen in there, clogging up that flow of water. And occasionally you might see this. You might see this massive fungal hyphae or spores. But most of the time, you would just see those symptoms in the tree. Now, oak wilt is a sudden lethal issue for trees. And the good news is that in Kentucky, we do not have a lot of it. We have had a few positive confirmations from northern Kentucky recently, but it's not a new thing in the state. We've had it for a long time. It's just typically at very low levels. So that's a good thing for us, in that it's not something that is likely to cause really widespread tree death at the moment. For whatever reason, we don't experience as much oak wilt as some other states, maybe further Midwest. They could have more problems with this, and it does cause really rapid tree death, and is something we don't want. Now, that could change if our trees become more stressed. One of the things that people have found is that oak wilt becomes worse, and you see more of it when you have droughts. If you have major insect issues, like something like spongy moth coming in and causing defoliation of a lot of trees. So not to say our trees are always going to be safe from oak wilt, but it's right now pretty minor. If you do see it, or something that's suspiciously like it, sudden death of an entire oak tree in the late summer, early fall, do report that to your county agent, and maybe send in a sample, because we'd like to have a better sense of where it is right now and what it's doing. But we have another disease that is super common in this area that has some very similar symptoms. And it's kind of like a light version of this, and that's called bacterial leaf scorch. So this disease is caused by a bacterium that does the same things. It's going to get in the vascular system, glob it all up, and prevent the flow of water. So you're going to see symptoms like the canopy turning brown in the late summer, early fall. You're going to see these scorched leaves. But bacterial leaf scorch, while it is a lethal disease for trees, it is much slower. It's going to take many, many years, little by little over time. It's going to cause the death of individual branches and eventually the death of the tree, but it's going to happen kind of over a much longer period of time. Also, many different species can get bacterial leaf scorch. While I see it worst on red oaks, you can find it on everything from ginkgo and hackberry and maple and sycamore. It's got a really broad host range there. It's something that you really can't prevent, in that it's being spread, that bacterium is being spread between trees by little leaf hoppers that naturally exist in plant-sucking insects. But the healthier a tree is, the less likely this is going to be a problem. And it turns out the species that causes bacterial leaf scorch, Xylella fastidiosa, while it has a huge range of different species that it can infect and cause problems on, there tend to be these strains that are very host specific. So I think if you've got higher diversity of trees, it's going to decrease your likelihood of having issues with it, because it's going to be less likely to spread tree to tree, just because you do have some of that specificity there. So most of the time when you see browning too early in a red oak, in central Kentucky, northern Kentucky, it's bacterial leaf scorch is where I would first look, versus oak wilt, which is a greater concern and good to have on your radar, but is much more rare. But all of these illustrate something that I think is important as we're thinking about tree diseases, and that is foliar symptoms can be very misleading. So if you look at this bacterial leaf scorch symptomatic leaf here, and you look at it and it looks like all the issue is in the leaf, but the issue really isn't in the leaf, right? It's in the stem, it's in the petiole, it's in the rest of the tree where you're seeing that loss of water. And so just because you see the symptoms in the leaf doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the problem is. But sometimes it can be. So sometimes you'll see diseases that are just impacting the leaves. Most of these are really minor issues. They might look bad, but they're really not a serious health concern for the tree. Now, some are a sign of something more significant going wrong. And they certainly can add up little stresses over time. But the good news is most of the time, most of the things that impact just the leaves of the tree are going to be pretty minor in terms of the tree's health. It might look bad and you might see it and be very concerned about it, but many of these are relatively minor issues. I'm going to mention one that I've seen a lot more of lately, and that is kind of maybe a more serious concern for some trees, and that's anthracnose. So anthracnose refers to a fungal disease that causes death of leaves and shoots of trees. It can affect a wide variety of hosts, and weather is really important for the severity of this disease. You're going to see more disease, more anthracnose, when the weather conditions are conducive to it, when conditions are wet and cool, right as the leaves are coming out of the trees just flushing and the fungus is sporulating. If it's dry during that time, you're probably not going to see as much disease. But here's some more pictures of it. It's something you typically see late spring, early summer. Those dead patches. In this case, it's sycamore, and sycamore is one of the trees that's most impacted by anthracnose, as well as dogwood in our area. It can actually be a health issue for those, whereas many other tree species can get anthracnose, and it's really a minor issue. For those trees that are more seriously impacted, there are fungicide options available. And here you can see another picture of what it might look like. Here's a shoot that has been killed, kind of, and has this little curved pattern on it. And what's causing this? Well, here you can see a canker there, the anthracnose fungus that's in there that's causing that damage, moving from that leaf into the branch as well. So we talked about canker, so it's another canker for you. Anthracnose can both be a leaf issue and a canker. So anthracnose, super common on trees. Most of the time, not a big deal. Occasionally, you can get, if the weather conditions are right, if the tree species are right, you can get more of it. But there are lots of them. And this is one called tar spot of maple that's popping up this time of year. And it's one that I wanted to use as an example because it can look bad. You look at this and you're like, whoa, there's something really wrong with this tree. But the good news is that this is not a big deal for the health of that tree. That tree is going to be fine. There's actually been many studies done on tar spot of maple, and they found that, trees don't have any negative impact of it. It just looks bad. They might drop their leaves a little bit early, but because this happens late in the season, late in the kind of fall, the leaves have done a lot of their photosynthesis by then. That's going to be much less damaging to a tree than something that impacts leaves early in the season typically. That can be a bigger problem because they still need to photosynthesize all summer. I did see that we had a question in the chat about, can anthracnose affect apple trees? And I believe so, but apple trees also get a whole set of their own diseases that we could address. They get a lot of different diseases, many of the same types. So we're talking about cankers and wilts and foliar issues. Apples will also get rust diseases and more. Today we're kind of focused on trees in more of that forest setting. But if you're interested in apples, they do face a lot of different disease issues, especially fungal diseases. And because of that, treatment can typically be a very important part of having productive, healthy apple trees. So I would defer to somebody who specializes in the area of apples on that. And we're going to kind of forge ahead talking kind of more about your forest and your shade trees. So we talked about how foliar symptoms can be misleading. And, another thing I wanted to talk about is sometimes you'll see problems in the above ground portion of the tree. You'll see the dead branches and the loss of leaves or the browned leaves. But what's causing that might be, we mentioned that might be in the vascular system, but that also might be below ground. So you might see the symptoms above ground, but the things that are causing those problems might be in the roots or at the base of the tree. And so we're going to talk a little bit about rots. So rots refer to wood decay fungi, and there are a lot of different fungi that can decay the wood of trees. They tend to be classed based on where they're growing on the tree. So the ones that are down at the base or impacting the roots of the trees, the ones that are kind of more in the heartwood, you can have rots that are coming from the top down. Let's say you had an ice storm or something that impacted the canopy of the tree, broke that out. Now, each of these are going to have different implications for the long-term health of those trees. If you've got something that's impacting the roots, the base of the trees are going to be more likely to tip over. If you have something that's impacting the heartwood of the tree, a lot of decay in there, more likely to break in half. Also, potentially a major issue from a timber value perspective, because that's the most valuable part of that wood. If you have something that's causing decay, in the branches in the upper part of the tree, maybe less of an issue structurally, but something that's going to get worse and worse over time. cause continuing issues. So there are many different species of fungi that can cause rot issues. These are going to range from aggressive pathogens to weak pathogens to saprophytes or things that are just breaking down dead wood. There's not a lot of difference from a fungus's perspective between a log that's sitting on the forest floor and a standing tree in that inner heartwood. That's going to be pretty similar from their perspective. And so a lot of these fungi are just opportunistic. They are taking advantage of wounds and they're taking advantage of stressed trees. So if there is a wound, that's a perfect entry point for a fungus. Typically, they're pretty inhibited by the bark and ability to get into the tree, but wounding can be a great opportunity for fungi that normally wouldn't really cause a problem to get into that tree and cause problems. So I mentioned some of the reasons that we care about rots. What are they doing in our trees? But something that I think is worth noting is that trees are really, in some ways, really good at compartmentalizing damage. So if, let's say, there's a wound and a fungus gets in there and it's decaying that tree, what the tree is going to do is it's going to try to seal off the new growth and prevent that from being impacted. But it's very hard for it to do anything about that kind of internal tissue, and the fungus can kind of run in there and just it's just trying to eat. It's eating the wood, it's breaking it down, and what might look very minor from our perspectives on the outside can result in a lot of damage to the tree over time. So this is a picture that I just like to show because I think it illustrates this. You've got this tiny little mark right here at the base of the tree, what someone might call cat facing or an old wound. Maybe there was a fire in there, maybe some equipment nicked it up a long time ago. Doesn't look like much, right? But then when you cut that tree open, you can see that while the tree's been able to continue growing and sealing off that damage, the fungi that are in there have been eating the wood. And, there's not going to be any value in that timber, but it may have very little impact to the tree health overall. Depending, it's going to make that tree less structurally stable for sure. But if it's putting on a lot of new growth, maybe that's okay. Maybe the tree will still be sound enough. But that's a question that you'd have of is that tree going to be more likely to fall? Maybe not a big problem if it's a tree in the woods. And certainly trees like this would have great value for wildlife, even if they did die. And not to say that this is, doesn't have some good properties to it. But if we're talking about trees in, our landscape, in our home setting, this is a tree in my neighborhood that fell during one of our recent storms. And you can see, unfortunately, fell on someone's house. Fortunately, no one was injured. But the inside of this tree was just totally decayed. It's pretty hollow in there. You can see different fungi have been in there eating the wood. And you can even see some fungal fruiting bodies, some mushrooms growing in there. So what are some species that commonly cause decay in our trees? Armillaria root rot is a really common one. There are many, though. But one of the challenging things about these is that you might see them when they produce mushrooms, whether it's armillaria root rot or something else. And it does in the fall. You'll see these mushrooms. People call them honey mushrooms growing from the base of the tree. But while those mushrooms are produced ephemerally, they come and they go, the tree fungus is in there 24/7, digesting that wood and breaking it down, causing that decay. So that's happening all the time, even if these mushrooms are only produced every now and then. Armillaria root rot, a key kind of feature to look for with it are these shoestring-like fungal structures. They're called rhizomorphs. And it also gives it the name of shoestring root rot. They're really thick, and you'll see that in trees or logs that have this fungus growing in them. There are many, many other fungi that cause root rot and rot to the base of trees. This is a Ganoderma rot here. You can see this tree has a lot of decay to its base, probably to some of the roots as well. And these are the mushrooms, the fungal fruiting bodies of that fungus. while you will see these every now and then, what you're not seeing is the fungus, the hyphal threads that are running through that wood, breaking down the cellulose and other structures for that tree. So there's lots of different fungi that can cause decay. So as we wrap up, I just want to mention one other thing because it comes up a lot in both the forestry and the landscape tree context, and it's decline. Decline is a general term that we use to describe gradual decline of the tree over time. There are many different definitions and types of decline, but in general, it's to represent this decline spiral of a tree getting worse and worse over time. And one thing that I will say is that it can be really, really hard once a tree is started to decline to improve its health and to pull it out of there. It's much better to be promoting the health of your tree early and preventing that decline from happening. So just to give you an example of how this might occur. So you might have some predisposing factors that contribute to this decline that set the stage for it. So maybe you're in a site with really bad soil, or it's not going to support vigorous tree growth. Maybe those trees are older and they're species that are known to be short-lived, or they have some existing health concerns. Then you might have some inciting factor, a trigger that really stresses those trees out. So it could be something like a drought. It could be maybe a major insect outbreak, or maybe some damage. There was some construction in that site that really stressed those trees. At that point, those trees are stressed, and there's all sorts of insects and fungi and pathogens that can act as nails in the coffin and really drive that tree decline and that slow progression over time to tree death. So, just thinking about where we are in Kentucky right now, in the past few years, we have experienced a lot of droughts. These are both pictures of drought-stressed trees in the forest. You can see, early fall color, the trees really struggling with that. We've experienced major weather events and windstorms and hurricanes and tornadoes and, lots of things that can also stress trees. And we have plenty of opportunistic issues that can move in on the tail end of these things, from the hypoxylon canker I mentioned before, the many different root rots that we have, or even insect issues like two-line chestnut borer and others that really take advantage of those stressed tree situations. So, we've been seeing a lot of tree decline, especially in our older red and black oaks in the state. As they reach the upper end of their life expectancy, it's natural, but it's also really important to know about that so you can plan for it. So when it comes to thinking about management options for tree diseases, we've talked about a lot of these individually, but I think a lot of it is setting the stage for success. So knowing your species and what the common issues are, and knowing your site, what is likely to be a problem there. And then avoiding preventable problems. This maybe sounds funny, but you can promote the health of your tree, and so many of the things that we talked about are stress issues. So if you're promoting the health of your tree, you're decreasing the likelihood of those issues in the future. Things like limiting damage and wounding to trees can go a long way, as well as little things like watering trees during droughts, mulching them if we're talking about landscaping trees. There's also something that I think about in terms of tree selection in a landscape setting. If you're planting trees in your yard, don't pick trees that are known to have major issues in our area. I'll talk to a lot of folks who planted a tree because they thought it looked really nice or they liked what it did, but it's a species that's really going to struggle in our area. And there's nothing you can do while you can try a lot of different things, you're not going to change that. So you can set yourself up for success by matching the site to the tree. Treatment of diseased trees is much harder. Diagnosis is key, so figuring out what the problem is, but it can be a challenge, even for professionals with a full lab setup. There are effective treatments for some things, whereas others, there are few management options after infection. You might have more options if we are talking about trees in your yard or trees. Someone mentioned, fruit trees earlier. The options available for those are going to be really different than, say, in a woodland setting when you're dealing with many hundreds of trees over acres. That's really going to change what your management would be. So that context really matters depending on where those trees are growing and what your options are. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation today, and we have a couple minutes for questions if anyone has them. Thanks for joining. Thanks for being part of Tree Week and this celebration of all things tree. If you have any questions, please do put those in the chat. All right. Well, if you do have any, I'm not seeing any right now, but if you do have any, feel free to reach out. You can ask those over email. And you can join us on From the Woods Today, our weekly webcast program. I'll have a regular segment on what's bugging my tree, addressing different insect and disease issues that are popping up different times of year, and hope to see you on there. Thanks again for joining us today, and I'll check again. I've got a question about what is used to treat laurel wilt disease. And so I'm actually going to pull up some slides for that that I've got here. So laurel wilt disease, that is the disease that's impacting sassafras trees that I mentioned earlier. And right now it's just in certain parts of the state, but if you're in one of those areas and you have a high value tree that you want to protect, I can provide some thoughts on that. If we wanted to just chat about laurel wilt disease, again, when we come to thinking about, how do we deal with something like this? It's going to require lots of different approaches because there's not going to be a silver bullet for laurel wilt or any invasive insect or disease that comes in. Things that can help are slowing its spread, so preventing it from getting here any faster than it's going to naturally. So not moving firewood, not moving potentially contaminated trees from one place to another, or even for those of you who are woodworkers, being cautious of that you could accidentally be moving around this deadly disease with it. Another thing that I would encourage folks to do is to recognize symptoms and report them early so we know where it is. So if you're seeing anything like diseased trees on the side of the road, report those to your county extension office or to me, and that way we can follow up and see what's going on there. And then let's talk about fungicide treatments. So currently there are treatments on label for sassafras, for laurel wilt disease. So you can do a trunk injection of a couple of different fungicides, and they're fungicides because you're trying to target that fungus that's growing in the tree. Typically these are again done as an injection. So here you can see how that injection would work. This is a macro injection with, I think this was propiconazole, but propizol and alamo are on label for laurel wilt disease. And both of those, the active chemical is propiconazole. And so you would inject your tree annually. Now, I am wrapping up a fungicide trial looking at the efficacy of some different fungicide approaches to sassafras trees in light of laurel wilt disease. And it seems like the fungicide treatment does last, from our preliminary results, at least a year. By the second year, you do start to see more symptoms and more decline in those trees. So it's something that's going to need to be repeated pretty regularly. In other systems, such as avocado, they are really looking at some new options with the fungicides, and maybe there will be more research there in the future, but at least based on our preliminary work with sassafras, this seems to be something that is best applied as a preventative, so before the trees start to decline, and then retreatment is going to be needed about every year. Now, that should be balanced with the fact that in order to do this treatment, you are drilling holes into the tree to inject them. So there's going to be some damage from that as well. So it's really something you only want to do where laurel wilt is active and things are problematic. And then just a note, as with any pesticide, you always want to follow that label. The label of those insecticides or fungicides is the law. So hopefully that provides a little bit more context on some of the fungicide options for laurel wilt disease. In addition to those, though, I do want to mention we are looking for trees with resistance. So in areas where laurel wilt disease is established and has killed all of the sassafras pretty much, going back and trying to see, are there any trees that are left? Do they potentially have resistance to laurel wilt disease? And so we do have an app that we're using to try to facilitate reports of that, Tree Snap. So you'll see other groups using it for species like chestnut and ash trees and hemlock, trying to find those special unique trees that are still alive when others have been killed by these invasive issues. So we're trying to look for sassafras. So if you happen to live in one of those counties where it's already arrived and causing big problems, let us know if you're seeing any trees that are left. So hopefully that addressed your question. And if you've got any others, please put those in the chat or the Q&A. All right. Well, great having you today. Thanks again for joining, and happy Tree Week to all of you.